the late 19th century. The self-propelled torpedo, invented during this period, was the ultimate democratic weapon. It promised the small, nimble craft the capability to sink the largest battleship in the world. This existence immediately forced navies everywhere to build the necessary countermeasure. They created the torpedo boat destroyer. For decades, early torpedo boats were narrow, steel-hulled vessels powered by steam. They are typically measured between 85 and 150 feet, and nudged speeds of only 30 knots. They were heavy, slow to accelerate, and extremely limited in deployment. The true turning point arrived with the internal combustion engine. Suddenly, unparalleled speed could be married to smaller, non-metallic hulls constructed of laminated mahogany, spruce, and oak. The United States Navy, however, lagged behind its European counterparts. Their initial designs were fundamentally flawed, unable to handle the rigors of open-sea operations. As critically, these early American hulls were too fragile to carry the heavy American torpedoes. The Navy needed a paradigm shift, which only arrived after adopting and re-engineering robust British designs. The strategic concept was alluringly simple, though deeply flawed in practice. The idea was to throw a handful of cheap, expendable wooden boats against the high payoff targets of the enemy battle line. If just one boat survived the inevitable curtain of fire to land a single fish, the trade was considered worth the cost. But did the theory hold up? Could a fragile wooden boat actually sustain that run?
1941, May.
The specifications were fixed. The boats needed to be 75 to 80 feet long, armed with 4 heavy 21-inch torpedo tubes. They had to carry enough armor-piercing ammunition for the twin 50-caliber machine guns and maintain a top speed of 40 knots. Achieving that speed, while fully loaded with warfighting gear, was the crucible that would determine success or failure. The stage was set off the New York coast in the summer of 1941 for what became known informally as the Plywood Derby. The air was thick with salt and the metallic tang of high-octane aviation gasoline. The challenge was a grueling 100-mile course designed to push the competing designs, Elko, Higgins, Huckins, and others, to their absolute breaking point. This was no pleasant yacht race. It was a torture test for wood and for flesh. The crews, already fatigued from weeks of preparation, were deafened by the screaming of the massive Packard V12 engines. They were forced to run full throttle for hours on end. Engineers hunched over the gauges, watching the water temperature climb, battling the warm Atlantic water that hampered the cooling systems. Every single knot counted in the speed trials, but endurance was the true measure of survival. Aboard one contender, the crew endured the rhythmic, brutal slam of the hull against the ocean swell. The boat was unarmored, meaning every impact resonated sharply through the mahogany planks. The jarring worked the gun mounts loose and shook the electrical systems free. The spray was a constant, cold, blinding sheet that forced the men to squint through streaming eyes, clinging desperately to the rails. They could feel the very structure of the boat straining beneath them. The early, lighter designs built specifically for speed records were visibly failing, their hulls twisting and their seams groaning under the relentless punishment. The Derby proved decisive. The boats had to be longer, and 70 to 80-foot range was essential for the stability needed to carry the immense weight of armament, fuel, and the crew of 12 to 14 men. The initial concept of a sleek, fragile racer was dead forever. What emerged were robust, re-engineered platforms capable of absorbing the hard pounding that would characterize their operational lives. The Elko and Higgins designs, which would become the most numerous, proved they could take the abuse. The Derby had stripped away the fantasy of the easily built, lightly armed speedster. It hammered home the reality that these boats, destined for the grueling tropical theaters, needed to be tough. They needed to carry not only their Mark 8 torpedoes, which were already proving frustratingly unreliable in trials, but also the heavy guns that would inevitably be retrofitted later. The Navy finally had its vessels, designed now not for a cinematic ambush but for survival in a protracted, violent war. The next step was figuring out how to train young, inexperienced men to survive the grueling green nightmare that awaited them overseas. 1942. The young men arrived at Melville, Rhode Island, with little more than a keen desire to serve and an almost complete lack of maritime experience. This was where the United States Navy tried to forge sailors out of raw recruits, instituting the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center. For 2 grueling months, officers and enlisted men were pushed through intense preparation. They learned to manage the temperamental Packard engines and the complex launch systems of the Mark 8 torpedoes. They practiced maneuvers until the boats felt like extensions of their own bodies. But the training was limited, often unrealistic, particularly concerning the actual use of the fish. The real education began only when they were shipped overseas. Their boats rode as deck cargo on tankers and oilers, bound directly for the oppressive heat of the Pacific. These bases were not the organized naval hubs of Pearl Harbor. They were crude, temporary outposts carved violently out of the jungle itself. Logistical support proved to be a mirage. In the crushing humidity, fuel was scarce, engine parts were non-existent, and malaria was a constant companion. Crews were left much on their own, forced into long, terrifying all-night patrols. They returned only to spend the daylight hours fighting the elements and repairing broken systems with baling wire and stolen parts. The official expectation of marauding hunter-killers quickly dissolved into the pragmatic reality of mechanical survival. The true test of the PT boat myth came in the narrow, enemy-choked waters of the Solomons. The Japanese called them devil boats, but their reputation far outpaced their actual combat record against the high-value targets of the Tokyo Express. 1943, August 1st. The night off Kolombangara was intended to be the ultimate ambush. 15 PT boats, spread across 3 squadrons, were tasked with intercepting 5 Japanese destroyers running supply into the area. The air was thick, humid, and utterly silent save for the low thrum of the boat's single-center engine. Stealth was everything in that environment. To minimize the easily detectable phosphorescent wake, the boats crept forward at a mere 8 knots. Aboard PT-109, Lieutenant John Kennedy squinted into the oily blackness. The wooden decks, painted dull green under Measure 31 camouflage, were crowded with armament. They carried the twin 50 caliber machine guns, the 20mm cannon, and the 4 heavy torpedo tubes. The crew of 12 was tense, every man fighting the fatigue of endless, boring hours of slow running. The engagement began immediately with confusion. Star shells erupted high overhead, turning the sea into blinding silver and black. They illuminated the boats as targets rather than concealing them as hunters. The destroyers, faster and better equipped with radar, held the immediate advantage as the first PTs roared into action, unleashing the full fury of their engines. The promised high-speed ambush devolved into a scattered, desperate melee. Torpedo after torpedo splashed into the dark water. They either ran true and failed to find a target, or worse, ran true and failed completely to detonate. The crews endured the sickening, frustrating experience of watching their primary weapon, the very reason their boats existed, prove completely useless. Kennedy held his position, waiting for a clear shot. The destroyers were moving fast, churning the water to foam. Then, out of the oily blackness, an impossible shape appeared. It was impossible close, impossibly fast. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, running without lights, was a silent black blade slicing through the night. There was no time for a warning shot. There was no time for tactical evasion. The scream of the Packard engines as Kennedy threw the throttles forward was instantly drowned out by a metallic shriek. That was the sound of the destroyer's bow slicing clean through the wooden hull. It wasn't a crash. It was a tearing, instantaneous sound. Wood fibers snapped under immense pressure. The world aboard PT-109 inverted instantly. The deck shuddered violently, throwing men against bulkheads and machinery. The force was catastrophic, splitting the 80-foot boat clean in 2. The shockwave slammed Kennedy across the deck and against the cockpit coaming. In the sudden cold silence that followed, the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with the salt spray. The stern section, holding the heavy guns and most of the fuel tanks, was immediately engulfed in flames. It sank almost instantly. Only the bow section, a shattered piece of floating debris, bobbed precariously on the swells. The ambush had failed utterly. 15 PT boats had launched 30 torpedoes at the enemy fleet that night. Not a single enemy vessel was damaged. The only casualty was the 109 itself, reduced to shattered wreckage by an unarmored, undetected ramming. The disaster off Kolombangara marked the definitive end of the myth. The romanticized image of the PT boat as the David that could reliably sink the Goliath was shattered along with the mahogany hull of the 109. The boats were simply too vulnerable. Their torpedoes were too unreliable. The enemy was too capable of spotting them in the dark. Yet the strategic need for these fast, versatile platforms remained absolute. The Navy could not afford to dismiss the PT boat entirely. They had to redefine its purpose. They were not ship killers. They were expendable, adaptable tools of attrition. They needed to stop hunting fleets. They needed to start hunting barges. The era of the high-speed gunboat, bristling with improvised armament and focused on the dirty work of coastal interdiction, was about to begin. The disaster off Kolombangara was a brutal lesson, etched forever into the ledger of the Pacific War. The PT boat, in its idealized role as a torpedo strike platform, was functionally obsolete. The enemy was too fast, the torpedoes too temperamental, and the wooden hulls too fragile. The brass, still prone to dismissing the crews as the Hooligan Navy, now had to face a hard reality. If these boats were to survive, they had to adapt completely. The strategic pivot was immediate and total. They moved from hunter-killer to disruptive gunboat, from striking capital ships to grinding down the enemy's logistics. It was the slow, vital blood flow of the Japanese island garrisons. The new target was the Barge, along the northeast coast of New Guinea and the shores of New Britain. The Japanese relied heavily on armed barges and Daihatsu landing craft. These craft crept from island to island at night, then hid beneath the overhanging jungle canopies during the day. These were not the glorious targets of naval legend. They were ugly, low-slung steel boxes, often armed with machine guns and light cannons. But they carried the food, ammunition, and reinforcements that kept bypassed Japanese bases from withering entirely. To sever that supply line was to win the war of attrition. This new mission demanded a complete technological re-engineering of the PT boat fleet. The standard armament, 4 heavy, space-consuming Mark 18 Mod 1 torpedo tubes, was now deemed excessive baggage. Crews began ripping out the tubes immediately to accommodate heavier, more practical firepower. The mantra shifted dramatically, from torpedo to shell. The decks of the Elco 80-footers and Higgins 78-footers quickly became crowded, makeshift armories. The twin 50-caliber machine gun turrets, which offered notoriously poor fire fans, were supplemented by a dizzying array of scrounged, borrowed, and requisitioned weapons. The 20mm Oerlikon cannon on the fantail was standard issue, and forward, crews were mounting anything they could get their hands on. They used 37mm M4 Colt Browning cannons, and sometimes even the Army's 37mm M3A1 anti-tank gun, bolted crudely to the forecastle. The pursuit of firepower was relentless. Later models bristled with 40mm Bofors M1 anti-aircraft guns, massive weapons for such small craft, and specialized rocket launchers. They repurposed the 4.5-inch Mark 8 rocket launchers and the 7.2-inch mousetrap racks, originally designed for anti-submarine warfare. These systems threw heavy projectiles 300 yards ahead of the boat, raining down contact-detonating fury onto the barges. The tremendous backblast and flash of these rockets added to the sensory overload, turning the cockpit into a terrifying, flickering hell. This technological adaptation was mirrored by an essential administrative one. In January of 1943, the Navy finally acknowledged the chaos. They formally established the commander, Motor Torpedo Boats Pacific. The Hooligan Navy was being professionalized. Its structural change was immediately followed by a logistical revolution. The Navy began deploying specialized MTB tenders known as AGPs. Converted LSTs and even former luxury yachts were pressed into service, transforming into mobile, self-contained bases. They were capable of supporting a full squadron for months at a time. The Portunus-class tenders represented a major leap, bringing the necessary fuel, parts, and repair capabilities right into the forward operating areas. Crews no longer had to rely solely on baling wire and electrical tape. But the heart of the new mission remained the nightly grind in the narrow channels. The air over the Bismarck Sea was thick and still, smelling of mangrove mud and engine oil.
It was 01:45.
PT-321, nicknamed Death's Head, was running silent. Its hull was painted in the dark, custom-adapted green Measure 31 camouflage designed to blend with the jungle vegetation. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds gripped the wheel tightly. His eyes were fixed on the Raytheon SJ radar screen, a glowing green circle of salvation recently installed and painstakingly calibrated. The integration of radar was a game-changer. It allowed the PT boats to hunt effectively in the pitch black that had once concealed the enemy. "Contact, skipper," called the radar operator, his voice tight with anticipation. "3 targets, maybe 4. They are slow-moving, hugging the coast, 2 miles out." "Packs," Reynolds muttered to himself. Barges always travelled in packs. PT-321 was running in tandem with PT-338, the Grey Ghost. This was the new doctrine, mutual support. If one boat was disabled, the other could tow it out, or, failing that, take off the crew. They moved on the center engine alone. The Packard V-12 was throttled back to a crawl, minimizing the phosphorescent wake that was so easily detectable in the tropical water. The slow, quiet approach, moving at around 8 knots, was a far cry from the mythical image of roaring out of the darkness at top speed. Reynolds gave the signal via blinker gun. 3 short flashes flew toward the Grey Ghost. "Close up. Prepare to engage." The boats eased into a firing position, their engines now idling completely. The only sounds were the gentle lap of the water against the mahogany hull and the nervous shifting of the crew. They were close enough now that the crew could hear the faint, low thrum of the Japanese diesels across the water. "Bring up the 37, Reynolds ordered. The gunner forward braced himself behind the new 37mm automatic cannon. Its muzzle was already pointed toward the shore. This was the weapon that truly made them barge busters.
Reynolds slammed the throttles forward.
The 3 Packard engines roared to life simultaneously, a deafening, terrifying sound that shattered the silence of the night. The boats leaped forward, throwing a massive white wake behind them, closing the range in mere seconds. The Japanese reacted instantly. Tracers erupted from the darkness. Red and green streams of 30 caliber and 20mm fire spitting back from the barges. The PT boat was famously unarmored. Every hit was a penetration. Fire. The 37mm cannon hammered, a deep, rhythmic thump-thump that shook the forecastle. The shells impacted the steel hull of the lead barge, sparking violently, tearing open holes below the waterline. Almost immediately, the Japanese response intensified drastically. The air around the Death's Head filled with the snap and whine of incoming rounds. A crewman screamed as a round slammed into the superstructure, shattering wood and sending splinters flying everywhere. Reynolds ignored the sharp pain in his shoulder, gripping the wheel even harder. He threw the boat into a hard turn, the mahogany hull heeling sharply as he tried desperately to break the enemy's lock, rockets away. From the deck, the 4.5-inch launchers spat fire. The heavy rockets streaked toward the second barge. They detonated with massive, concussive blasts of white light. The barge, already listing, instantly disappeared in a pillar of black smoke and spray. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. The PT boats were maneuvering at such high speed they were incredibly difficult targets for the fixed guns of the barges. As the Death's Head circled back, the Grey Ghost was hosing the remaining targets. Twin 50 caliber fire stitched long, destructive lines across the enemy decks. The smell of cordite and burning wood was overwhelming. When the PT boats finally pulled away, 2 of the barges were clearly sinking, their silhouettes sitting low in the dark water. The third was burning fiercely, illuminating the jungle shore like a massive torch. The fourth had fled desperately into the shallows. It was not glamorous work. It was brutal, close-quarters combat fought against heavily armed, yet ultimately slower, logistics craft. There was no glory in sinking a barge. There was only the cold, hard, strategic reality that another shipment of rice or ammunition would never reach its destination. This became the new life of the PT boat crewmen. Their mission was no longer the glorious ambush of a fleet. It was the nightly, grueling, violent patrol against the enemy's coastal shipping. They maneuvered through poorly charted waters, always one mechanical failure, or one lucky enemy shot away from disaster. The myth of the PT boat had died, but the boat itself, transformed into a high-speed gun platform, had finally found its indispensable role in the Pacific War. The global war of attrition demanded the PT boat be everywhere. Even as the barge busters perfected their gruesome trade in the Solomons, They fought a constant battle against marine growth that clung to their hulls. The warm tropical water throttled their engine cooling systems, yet the vessels were deployed globally. The strategic imperative was clear. Wherever enemy logistics flowed, the so-called Hooligan Navy must disrupt it, ensuring that bypassed Japanese bases were left only to wither. The transition to the Mediterranean brought new enemies and new constraints entirely. 3 squadrons found themselves working alongside British MTBs off the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Here, the German threat was far more sophisticated, involving swift E-boats and intense coordinated air attacks. The crews, now swelled to 15 men, often endured hot sheeting, sharing bunks on rotations in the cramped quarters. Their primary mission shifted to intelligence collection, pilot recovery, and attacking coastal shipping. They arrived carrying a massive inventory of the very weapon that had betrayed them in the Pacific, the obsolete Mark 8 torpedo. These fish were heavy, unreliable, and notoriously prone to running off course, yet they were plentiful. The crews, driven by a pragmatic resourcefulness born of desperate necessity, devised a new, unorthodox tactic for their disposal. It was a moonless night in the Tyrrhenian Sea, 1944. The air was cool compared to the steaming tropics, but the core tension remained the same. PT-211 crept toward an Italian port, running only on the single-center Packard engine. The low, quiet thrum was a calculated risk against the sound of the waves. The crew huddled on deck, their faces illuminated only by the faint red glow of the instrument panel. Lieutenant Commander O'Malley stood by the torpedo tubes, the thick, heavy cylinders of the Mark 8s ready. These were not aimed at a specific German supply ship, not tonight. The enemy vessels were safely tucked deep inside the harbour breakwater. The objective was the port itself. The docks, the warehouses, and the vital infrastructure. Tubes 1 and 2, set depth to shallow. Fire blind on my mark, O'Malley commanded. The torpedo man confirmed the settings, his hands moving quickly over the mechanism. The Mark 8 was designed as a contact detonator. The crews knew that even if it missed a hull, hitting a stone pier or running into the seabed beneath a dock could yield spectacular results. This was less a surgical strike and more a calculated act of terror and disruption. O'Malley gave the signal. The crew braced themselves. With a rush of compressed air, the first torpedo shot from the tube, plunging violently into the dark water. A moment later, the second followed. The launch was a violent, physical act. The heavy roll of the boat momentarily threw the crew off balance. The launch systems had always been cumbersome, but tonight they were instruments of crude, widespread destruction. They immediately slammed the throttles forward. The 3 V12 engines screamed, consuming 100-octane fuel at a rate that would drain the tanks in 6 hours. The boat planed violently, turning out to sea at flank speed, the wake boiling white behind them. They had to be gone before the first German searchlights snapped on. The crew waited, counting. The seconds stretched into minutes, filled only by the roaring wind and the vibrating hull. Then came the gratification. Behind them, miles away, a massive echoing boom rolled across the water. It was followed quickly by a second, even larger detonation. The sound was immense, shaking the air around the fleeing boat. A pillar of orange and black fire briefly lit the horizon, offering a momentary sunrise over the Italian coast. The simple expedient had worked. Firing the obsolete Mark 8's blind into the port area was certainly not textbook naval strategy, but it was devastatingly effective. They were not claiming a destroyer, but they were crippling the enemy's ability to offload vital supplies. The feeling of success, however desperate, momentarily superseded the grueling reality of their existence, the constant threat of being targeted by German aircraft, and the knowledge that their wooden hull offered zero protection against anything heavier than a pistol round. The adaptability of the PT boat continued to be tested across the globe. By March of 1944, squadrons were operating in the English Channel, preparing for the invasion of France. The challenge was less the stifling heat and more the cold, foul weather that hampered speed and maneuverability. Operating under British coastal forces, they supported the Normandy landings, transitioning from hunters to escorts, rescuers, and screeners against the persistent threat of German E-boats. They delivered senior officers ashore and rescued survivors from the freezing water, often maneuvering through friendly minefields. The cost was high. 3 PTs were lost in the Channel. a tragic testament to the fact that their perceived expendability was often realized. Yet they endured. They became indispensable platforms for every mission imaginable, except the one they were originally designed for. They became the unsung couriers, the anti-submarine patrols, now equipped with depth charges preset for shallow depths. They were the scouts and the air-sea rescue craft. They inflicted significant damage on coastal shipping and logistics, ultimately justifying their high attrition rate. When the war finally ended, the Navy rendered its final brutal judgment on these unique vessels. The surviving PT boats, battered, worn, and scarred by years of tropical and northern deployment, were deemed useless. Mothballing wooden boats was simply impractical. The ultimate fate of the Hooligan Navy was decided on the beaches of Samar in the Philippines in late 1945. 121 boats, the very symbols of speed, daring, and improvisation, were systematically beached. They were stripped of usable parts and then set completely alight. The mahogany hulls that had endured the pounding of the Plywood Derby, the ramming off Kolombangara, and the intense fire of countless barge runs, now burned in a final massive pyre. They left behind only the ash and the profound legacy of crews who had fought a bitter war against the sea, the enemy, and obsolescence itself. The war of attrition demanded the PT boat be everywhere at once. Even as the barge busters perfected their gruesome trade in the Solomons, fighting the constant battle against marine growth that clung to their hulls, the vessels were deployed globally. They struggled daily against the warm tropical water that throttled their engine cooling systems. The strategic imperative was clear. Wherever enemy logistics flowed, the Hooligan Navy must disrupt it, ensuring that bypassed Japanese bases were left only to wither. The transition to the Mediterranean brought new enemies and new constraints. 3 squadrons found themselves working alongside British MTBs off the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Here, the German threat was far more sophisticated, involving swift E-boats and intense coordinated air attacks. The crews now swelled to 15 men, often endured hot sheeting, sharing bunks on rotations in the cramped quarters. Their primary mission was now intelligence collection, pilot recovery, and attacking coastal shipping. They arrived, carrying a massive inventory of the very weapon that had so often betrayed them in the Pacific. The obsolete Mark 8 torpedo. These fish were heavy, unreliable, and notoriously prone to running off course, yet they were plentiful. The crews, driven by a pragmatic resourcefulness born of desperate necessity, devised a new unorthodox tactic for their disposal. It was a moonless night in the Tyrrhenian Sea in 1944. The air was cool compared to the steaming tropics, but the tension was exactly the same. PT-211 crept toward an Italian port, running quietly on the single-center Packard engine. The low, quiet thrum was a calculated risk against the sound of the waves. The crew huddled on deck, their faces illuminated only by the faint red glow of the instrument panel. Lieutenant Commander O'Malley stood by the torpedo tubes, the thick, heavy cylinders of the Mark 8s ready. These were not aimed at a specific German supply ship, not tonight. The enemy vessels were safely tucked deep inside the harbour breakwater. The objective was the port itself, the docks, the warehouses, the infrastructure. Tubes 1 and 2, set depth to shallow, O'Malley commanded. Fire blind on my mark. The torpedo man confirmed the settings, his hands moving quickly over the mechanism. The Mark 8 was a contact detonator, but the crews knew that even if it missed a hull, hitting a stone pier or running into the seabed beneath a dock could yield spectacular results. It was less a surgical strike and more a calculated act of terror and widespread disruption. O'Malley gave the signal. The crew braced themselves. With a rush of compressed air, the first torpedo shot from the tube, plunging violently into the dark water. A moment later, the second followed. The launch was a violent, physical act, the heavy roll of the boat momentarily throwing the crew off balance. The launch systems had always been cumbersome, but tonight they were instruments of crude, widespread destruction. They immediately slammed the throttles forward. The 3 V12 engines screamed, consuming 100-octane fuel at a rate that would drain the tanks in 6 hours. The boat planed violently, turning out to sea at flank speed, the wake boiling white behind them. They had to be gone before the first German searchlight snapped on. The crew waited, counting. The second stretched into minutes, filled only by the roaring wind and the vibrating hull. Then, the gratification. Behind them, miles away, a massive, echoing boom rolled across the water. It was followed quickly by a second, even larger detonation. The sound was immense, shaking the air around the fleeing boat. A pillar of orange and black fire briefly lit the horizon, appearing like a momentary sunrise over the Italian coast. The simple expedient had worked perfectly. Firing the obsolete Mark 8's blind into the port area was certainly not the textbook naval strategy, but it proved remarkably effective. They weren't claiming a destroyer, but they were crippling the enemy's ability to offload vital supplies. The feeling of success, however desperate, momentarily superseded the grueling reality of their existence. They endured the constant threat of being targeted by German aircraft, and the knowledge that their wooden hull offered zero protection against anything heavier than a pistol round. The adaptability of the PT boat continued to be tested across the globe. By March 1944, squadrons were operating in the English Channel, preparing for the invasion of France. Here, the challenge was less the stifling heat and more the cold, foul weather that severely hampered speed and maneuverability. Operating under British coastal forces, they supported the Normandy landings. They transitioned from hunters to escorts, rescuers and screeners against the persistent threat of German E-boats. It was June 5, 1944. The English Channel was a chaotic, churning mass of vessels, yet the atmosphere aboard PT-796 was cold, tense and meticulously ordered. The boat, a Higgins 78-footer, was painted in a dark, pragmatic camouflage, its silhouette riding low on the water, and he were part of the vast screen protecting the flanks of the invasion force. They were specifically tasked with escorting minesweepers and fending off swift German Schnellboot. The crew, layered in thick, cumbersome Kapok life vests, endured the rhythmic slam of the boat running head-on into the high swells. Each impact jarred the newly installed 40mm Bofors gun mount, severely testing the integrity of the mahogany hull. The motion was sickening, what some called a grueling green nightmare, compounded further by the freezing spray. Lieutenant Johnson stood exposed on the bridge, scanning the rough horizon. The mission was not glorious. It was the essential, thankless task of ensuring the larger fleet could simply survive the night. They had already delivered a senior officer ashore, a crucial courier service, and now they were the eyes and ears of the flank. Around 0300, the radar operator detected a flicker. Fast-moving contacts, low to the water, were closing quickly. E-boats. Target bearing 090, closing fast. 3 contacts. Johnson grabbed the microphone immediately. Al Hands, General Quarters. Engage on my mark. Don't waste the 40mm, we'll hit them with the 50s first. The E-boats were renowned for their speed and heavy torpedo armament. It was the PT boat's original mission, inverted, defending against the small, fast torpedo attacker. The night exploded into violence. German tracer fire, bright, continuous streams, began to stitch the water around the PT boat. The E-boats had spotted them first, using star shells to illuminate the target. The brief, blinding light caught PT-796 in the open, turning the dark green hull into a vulnerable target. Johnson threw the boat into a violent turn, the engines screaming in protest as they struggled against the cold North Sea. Open fire! The twin 50-caliber machine guns on the port and starboard turrets hammered back, the sound a continuous metallic drum roll. The machine gunners, exposed in their open mounts, poured fire toward the German silhouettes. The 40mm Bofors, usually reserved for aircraft, began to bark, sending massive, high-explosive shells toward the lead E-boat. The German craft, realizing they were facing a heavily armed screening force, broke formation. One of the E-boats, caught in a crossfire, took a direct hit on its bow. A massive geyser of water and steam erupted, and the contact vanished completely from the radar screen. The skirmish ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The remaining E-boats were unwilling to press the attack against the combined fire of the screening force. They utilized smoke generators, fleeing back toward the French coast. PT-796 had survived the encounter. Its decks were littered with spent casings, and the chart house had taken a glancing blow from shrapnel. They had not sunk a capital ship in the fight, but they had successfully screened the minesweepers, rescuing survivors from a nearby destroyer that had struck a mine. Crucially, they ensured the vital sea lanes remained open for the invasion. The sheer adaptability, from anti-small craft operations in the English Channel to intelligence runs in the Mediterranean, and relentless barge busting in the Pacific, was the ultimate contribution of the PT boat. They were the expendable workhorses of the Navy, the true multi-role vessels. They provided a torpedo attack capability similar to a destroyer, but at a fraction of the cost. They possessed a flexibility that no larger vessel could ever match. By the end of the war, 768 US-built PT boats had been produced. Only 69 were lost to enemy action, friendly fire, storms, and accidents, with 12 more stricken as obsolete. Despite their successes, the wooden hulls were battered and worn by years of relentless operational use. They were deemed to have no further use. The final chapter of the PT boat saga was not a heroic charge, but a silent, pragmatic disposal. On the beaches of Samar in the Philippines in late 1945, the 121 boats were beached. They were then deliberately set on fire. The flames consumed the laminated mahogany, the twin 50 caliber turrets, and the ghost of the impossible myth. They burned not as failures, but as symbols of a necessary evolution in naval warfare. Their true legacy was secured not in the ambush of the fleet, but in the countless crucial, unromantic missions. These missions allowed the US Navy to attrite the enemy and ultimately win the island-hopping war. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.